Picture this scene. It's a gray morning in 1927, somewhere around March or April. Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, between 57th and 58th Streets. A crowd has gathered on the sidewalk, held back by police barriers. They're watching something that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. Wrecking balls swinging through the walls of what was, until very recently, the largest and most magnificent private residence in all of New York City. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, a limestone and brick chateau that looked like it had been transported stone by stone from the Loire Valley, is being systematically destroyed. The mansion wasn't just big, it was colossal. It occupied the entire Fifth Avenue frontage of the block, with its main entrance on the avenue and wings extending back along both 57th and 58th Streets. We're talking about 137 rooms spread across multiple floors. The grand entrance hall was 3 stories high, with a marble staircase that swept up dramatically, illuminated by stained glass windows created by John Lafarge, one of America's most celebrated artists. The ballroom could accommodate hundreds of guests and featured gilded ceiling decorations that had been created by European craftsmen specifically imported for the project. The library walls were covered in hand-tooled Moroccan leather. The morning room had windows of Tiffany glass. Every bedroom, and there were dozens, had its own fireplace with a marble mantelpiece, many of them carved by sculptors whose work now sits in museums. And it wasn't just the architecture. The house was filled with art that would make any museum curator weep with envy. There were paintings by old masters hanging in the galleries, Renaissance tapestries on the walls, furniture that had once belonged to French aristocrats, Oriental rugs from Persia, porcelain from China that was centuries old. The value of the contents alone would have been in the tens of millions of dollars even in 1927 currency. So why was it being demolished? The simple answer is money, or rather, the lack of it. But that simple answer opens up into a much more complex and fascinating story about American society, about how wealth works, about the costs of maintaining grandeur, and about how quickly even the most solid-seeming social structures can crumble. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had died back in 1899. He'd been one of the richest men in America, with a fortune estimated at around $70 million, which doesn't sound like much today, but adjusted for the size of the economy at the time, we're talking about wealth equivalent to something like $50 to $60 billion in modern terms. But here's the thing about these Gilded Age fortunes. They looked more solid than they actually were. Much of the wealth was tied up in assets: real estate, stocks, bonds, art collections. And maintaining properties like this Fifth Avenue mansion required constant, enormous cash flow. The annual operating costs for the Vanderbilt mansion in the 1920s were estimated at around $200,000, and that's in 1920s dollars. To put that in perspective, that's something like $3.5 million in today's money every single year, just to keep the lights on, the staff paid, the building maintained, and the property taxes covered. And property taxes were brutal. As Manhattan real estate values skyrocketed in the 1920s, the tax assessment on this property went through the roof. The land alone was assessed at millions of dollars, and the city wanted its cut. Meanwhile, the Vanderbilt fortune was being split among multiple heirs with each generation, diluted by estate taxes, which had been introduced in 1916, and strained by the maintenance costs of multiple properties. The family owned not just this Fifth Avenue mansion, but also the breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, which cost $7 million to build in the 1890s, plus numerous other estates and properties. Each one required staff, maintenance, and taxes. By the mid-1920s, the family made a practical decision. They couldn't afford to keep the Fifth Avenue mansion. The building was sold in 1926 to Benjamin Winter, a real estate developer, for $7 million. Winter's intention was clear from the beginning. The mansion would be demolished and the land would be used for a commercial development. The economics were simple. The land was worth far more with a commercial building on it than with a private mansion, no matter how magnificent. The family held an auction for the contents: paintings, furniture, decorative objects, everything. Some pieces went to museums, some to other wealthy collectors, some were bought by dealers and scattered to the winds. Then the wrecking crews moved in, and within months, one of the most spectacular private residences ever built in America was reduced to rubble. In its place rose a building that's still there today, the Bergdorf Goodman department store, selling luxury goods to wealthy shoppers who probably have no idea they're standing on the site of an even greater luxury. This single demolition symbolizes the entire arc of what historians call the Gilded Age, a period roughly from the 1870s through the early 1900s, when America experienced both spectacular economic growth and equally spectacular inequality, when industrial capitalism created fortunes that dwarfed anything that had come before, when the newly rich built monuments to themselves that rivaled anything European royalty had created, and when social life among the elite became a kind of elaborate theater with its own rules, rituals, and power dynamics. The term Gilded Age itself comes from an 1873 novel by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. The title was deliberately ironic. Something that's gilded looks like solid gold on the surface, but underneath it's just base metal with a thin layer of gold leaf. That's exactly what Twain and Warner thought about their era: spectacular wealth and progress on the surface, but underneath, corruption, exploitation, and social problems. They weren't entirely wrong, but they also weren't entirely right. The Gilded Age was complex, contradictory, and in many ways, it set the template for modern America. Understanding this period isn't just an exercise in nostalgia or architectural appreciation. It's about understanding a crucial transformation in American society, from a largely agricultural regional economy emerging from the devastation of civil war to an industrial powerhouse with a truly national and eventually international reach. It's about understanding how enormous concentrations of wealth affect society, what happens when there's minimal regulation of business, how social hierarchies form and eventually break down, and why even the most magnificent monuments to wealth can't survive when the economic and social conditions that created them change. In this extended exploration, we're going to dig deep into every aspect of the Gilded Age mansion phenomenon. We'll start with the economic transformation that made it all possible, the industrial explosion after the Civil War that created the conditions for unprecedented wealth accumulation. We'll look at the specific individuals who built the great fortunes, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and others, and how they did it. We'll examine the social warfare between old money and new money, the battle for acceptance fought in ballrooms and on the pages of society newspapers. We'll walk through the mansion building, craze that transformed Fifth Avenue from a residential street into a showcase of palatial architecture. We'll look at the elaborate social rituals, the balls, dinners, and gatherings that were as much about power as about pleasure. We'll go behind the scenes to understand the army of servants who made these households function. And finally, we'll examine why it all came crashing down, why those magnificent mansions couldn't survive into the modern era. This is a story told through documented facts, real numbers, and the actual experiences of real people. It's a story that resonates today because we're living through our own period of rising inequality, of vast fortunes being created by technology and finance, of questions about regulation and the power of concentrated wealth. The Gilded Age has lessons for us, if we're willing to listen to what history has to say. So let's start at the beginning, with the wreckage of a nation torn apart by civil war and the remarkable industrial transformation that followed. Development. The post-1865. Industrial explosion, building the foundation for unprecedented wealth. To understand where all this Gilded Age wealth came from, we need to start with the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War. In April 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, the United States was in a state that we can barely imagine today. The war had killed somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 people, out of a total population of about 31 million. That's roughly 2% of the entire population dead, and many more wounded or disabled. To put that in perspective, an equivalent proportion today would mean about 7 million American deaths. The South was utterly devastated. Cities like Atlanta, Columbia, and Richmond had been burned. The plantation economy had collapsed with the abolition of slavery. Infrastructure, railroads, bridges, roads, had been destroyed by armies marching back and forth across the landscape. The Confederate currency was worthless. Millions of formerly enslaved people were free but had no property, no education, and faced a hostile white population that resented their freedom. The North was in better shape economically. The war had actually stimulated Northern industry, but it too faced massive challenges. There were hundreds of thousands of veterans who needed to be reintegrated into civilian life. The government had enormous war debts to pay off. The country was politically divided and angry, with Reconstruction policies creating ongoing conflict between North and South, between Congress and President, between different visions of what the reunited nation should look like. And yet, despite all this chaos and devastation, something remarkable happened. America experienced the most rapid industrial growth in its history. Within just a few decades, the United States transformed from a primarily agricultural economy, lagging behind European powers in industrial production, to the world's leading industrial nation, producing more steel, mining more coal, refining more oil, and building more railroads than any other country on Earth. How did this happen? The answer involves multiple factors coming together at the same historical moment, creating conditions that were perfect for explosive economic growth and for the concentration of enormous wealth in relatively few hands. The Railroad Revolution. Let's start with railroads, because they were absolutely central to everything else. In 1865, the United States had about 35,000 miles of railroad track, mostly in the north and mostly consisting of local or regional lines. By 1900, just 35 years later, there were over 193,000 miles of track crisscrossing the nation. By 1916, at the peak of railroad construction, the figure was over 254,000 miles. This wasn't just quantitative growth. It was a fundamental transformation in how the American economy worked. Before the railroad boom, American business was essentially regional. If you manufactured shoes in Massachusetts, your practical market was New England and maybe New York. Shipping goods long distances by wagon or canal was slow and expensive. A manufacturer in Chicago couldn't easily compete with a manufacturer in Philadelphia for customers in New York because the Chicago company couldn't get its goods there fast enough or cheap enough. Railroads changed everything. Suddenly, a manufacturer in Chicago could ship goods to New York in a matter of days, reliably and relatively cheaply. Standard time zones were established in 1883 specifically to make railroad schedules work. Before that, every city had its own local time. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines met at Promontory Summit in Utah, meant you could travel from New York to San Francisco in less than a week, something that had previously taken 4 to 6 months by wagon train around Cape Horn by ship. This created a true national market for the first time in American history. A company could now manufacture products in one location and sell them across the entire country. This led to economies of scale that were previously impossible. If you were making 1,000 units and selling them locally, your per-unit costs were relatively high. If you could make 100,000 units and sell them nationally, your per-unit costs dropped dramatically. Larger factories were more efficient than small shops, and only larger companies could afford to build larger factories. This dynamic, larger is more efficient, which makes you more profitable, which lets you grow even larger, was fundamental to the concentration of wealth that characterized the Gilded Age. But railroads didn't just carry manufactured goods. They opened up the American West in ways that had been impossible before. You could ship cattle from Texas to Chicago in railroad cars. You could mine copper in Montana and ship it to factories in Pennsylvania. You could harvest wheat in Kansas and ship it to New York for export to Europe. The rich natural resources of the American interior and West, which had been difficult or impossible to exploit before, suddenly became accessible. The railroad companies themselves became some of the largest businesses in America, and some of the first truly large-scale corporations. Building and operating thousands of miles of track required capital investment on a scale that America had never seen before. It required organizational structures, hierarchies of managers, standardized procedures, complex scheduling that were entirely new. Many of the management techniques that we now take for granted in modern corporations were first developed by railroad companies in the late 19th century. The telegraph. Information at the speed of electricity. Running parallel to, literally, the railroad tracks were telegraph lines. The telegraph had been invented in the 1840s, but it really came into its own after the Civil War. By 1870, there were about 200,000 miles of telegraph wire in the United States. By 1880, that had grown to well over 500,000 miles. The impact of near-instantaneous communication is hard to overstate. Before the telegraph, information traveled at the speed of a horse or a train. If you were a businessman in New York and needed to know prices in San Francisco, you'd have to wait weeks for a letter. With the telegraph, you could know in minutes. This allowed for the coordination of business across vast distances in ways that were previously impossible. Stock markets could function nationally. Commodities could be traded with much less price arbitrage between regions. Companies could coordinate their operations across multiple locations. News could spread across the country in hours rather than weeks. The telegraph created what we might call the first version of the real-time economy, where decisions could be made based on up-to-the-minute information. The Steel Revolution, building the modern world. Steel was another crucial factor. Steel had existed for centuries, but it was expensive to produce and therefore rare. Most metal structures were built with iron, which is strong but brittle. Steel is much stronger and more flexible than iron, but traditional methods of making it were slow and costly. That changed with the Bessemer process, developed in the 1850s but not widely adopted in America until after the Civil War. The Bessemer process allowed for the mass production of cheap steel by blowing air through molten pig iron to remove impurities. Suddenly, steel went from being a precious material to being cheap enough to use for railroad rails, bridge construction, building frames, and countless other applications. American steel production in 1867 was about 20,000 tons. By 1879, it had increased to about 1 million tons. By 1900, it was over 10 million tons, more than the total production of Great Britain and Germany combined. This explosive growth was driven by the railroad boom. Steel rails lasted much longer than iron rails, by the construction of steel-framed buildings, which made skyscrapers possible, by the needs of a growing machine industry, and by dozens of other applications. The steel industry, more than almost any other, demonstrated the power of economies of scale. A large modern steel mill with the latest technology could produce steel far more cheaply than a small operation. This meant that companies that could raise the capital to build large mills had enormous advantages over smaller competitors. And the biggest advantage often went to the company that could control not just steel production, but also the inputs: iron ore mines, coal mines, limestone quarries, the transportation to move these materials to the mills. The oil industry, from illumination to industrial power. In 1859, Edwin Drake drilled the first successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. At first, oil was used primarily for kerosene, which replaced whale oil for lighting. But the applications quickly expanded. lubrication for machines, fuel for heating, and eventually, though not until the 1890s and early 1900s, fuel for the internal combustion engine. The oil industry grew with stunning speed. From basically nothing in 1859, by 1880, the United States was producing about 26 million barrels of oil per year. By 1900, that had grown to about 63 million barrels. Oil wells sprouted up across Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and later in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. What made oil particularly interesting from an economic perspective was that crude oil by itself wasn't particularly useful. It had to be refined into kerosene, gasoline, and other products. This meant that whoever controlled the refining process had enormous power over the industry. As we'll see when we talk about John D. Rockefeller, control of refining and of transportation to move oil from wells to refineries and from refineries to customers was the key to building the most successful oil monopoly in history. Immigration, the human fuel for industrial growth. None of this industrial growth would have been possible without workers, and those workers came in massive numbers from Europe. Between 1865 and 1900, over 11 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Between 1900 and 1914, another 13 million arrived. Most came from Europe, first from Germany, Ireland, and Britain, and later from Italy, Poland, Russia, and other parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. These immigrants provided the labor that built the railroads, mined the coal, worked in the steel mills, operated the factories, and constructed the cities. They worked for wages that native-born Americans often wouldn't accept, and under conditions that were frequently dangerous. Industrial accidents were common, workdays were long, often 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week, and there were essentially no safety regulations or worker protections. The flood of immigration also helped keep wages low, which increased profits for factory owners and industrialists. When workers tried to organize unions or strike for better conditions, companies could often find replacement workers among newly arrived immigrants who were desperate for any job. This dynamic, abundant labor keeping wages down, which increased profits, which allowed for more investment and growth, was another factor in the concentration of wealth at the top. The role of government, laissez-faire, and corruption. One more factor is crucial to understanding the Gilded Age economic boom: the role of government, or rather, the lack of it. The prevailing economic philosophy of the era was laissez-faire, the idea that government should keep its hands off business and let the market work things out. This meant there were essentially no regulations on business practices. There were no antitrust laws until the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and even that wasn't seriously enforced for years. There were no meaningful regulations on working conditions, no minimum wage laws, no restrictions on child labor. Children as young as 10 or 12 commonly worked in factories and mines, no requirements for workplace safety. There were also no corporate income taxes and no personal income taxes, except during the Civil War. The federal government's revenue came mainly from tariffs on imported goods and excise taxes on specific products like alcohol and tobacco. This meant that the wealthy could accumulate and keep their fortunes with minimal government interference. Moreover, government, when it did intervene, often did so on the side of business. When workers struck, state militias or federal troops were sometimes called in to break the strikes. Courts issued injunctions against labor organizing. Police forces often acted as de facto security for businesses against workers. At the same time, there was significant corruption. Business leaders routinely bribed politicians and officials to get favorable treatment. Land grants for railroads, protective tariffs to keep out foreign competition, contracts for government supplies, and favorable regulations, or the lack thereof. The phrase robber baron, which is often applied to the great industrialists of this era, originally referred to their use of corrupt practices and monopolistic power, not just their wealth. All of these factors, railroads creating a national market, telegraph enabling rapid communication, steel and oil creating new industries, abundant immigrant labor, economies of scale favoring large companies, and minimal government regulation came together to create conditions perfect for rapid industrial growth and for the accumulation of unprecedented personal fortunes. By 1890, the United States had surpassed Great Britain to become the world's leading industrial nation. And the men who had positioned themselves at the center of this transformation in railroads, steel, oil, and finance had become richer than anyone in American history. Which brings us to our next topic, the empire builders themselves. The empire builders, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and the creation of American fortunes. The industrial transformation we just described created opportunities for certain individuals to accumulate wealth on a scale that was genuinely unprecedented. We're not talking about people who were moderately wealthy or even very wealthy. We're talking about individuals who controlled fortunes so large that they represented significant percentages of the entire American economy. Let's look at the three most famous examples: Cornelius Vanderbilt and his descendants, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller. Cornelius Vanderbilt, from ferry captain to railroad baron. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, was born in 1794 on Staten Island, New York. His family was poor. His father ran a small ferry service. Vanderbilt left school at age 11 and went to work with his father. By age 16, he'd borrowed $100 from his mother, which he repaid with interest, and bought his own small sailboat to start a ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan. This was during the era before railroads, when steamboats were revolutionizing water transportation. Vanderbilt recognized the potential early and began building a fleet of steamboats. He was ruthless in competition. He'd cut prices to drive competitors out of business, then raise them once he had a monopoly on a route. He worked hard, lived relatively simply, at least early in his life, and reinvested his profits in more boats. By the 1840s, Vanderbilt had a substantial fortune from his steamship operations. During the California Gold Rush of 1849, he made millions operating a route to California via Nicaragua, which was faster than going around Cape Horn. By the 1850s, he was one of the richest men in America, with a fortune estimated at around $11 million. Enormous wealth for that era. But Vanderbilt's real masterstroke came after the Civil War, when he was already in his 70s. He recognized that railroads were the future and began buying up railroad lines. He started with the New York and Harlem Railroad, then the Hudson River Railroad, and finally the New York Central Railroad, which ran from New York to Buffalo. He consolidated these into a single system, improving efficiency and profitability. Vanderbilt's strategy was simple: control the transportation routes and charge everyone else to use them. By the time he died in 1877, at age 82, he controlled most of the rail lines between New York and Chicago, and his fortune had grown to about $105 million, roughly 1/87th of the entire gross domestic product of the United States at the time. Adjusted for the size of the economy, this would be equivalent to over $200 billion today, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in American history. Vanderbilt was not a particularly refined or educated man. He was known for his rough language, his ruthless business practices, and his lack of interest in high society or philanthropy. When he died, he left the vast majority of his fortune, about $95 million, to his oldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, with relatively small bequests to his other children. This decision to keep the fortune concentrated rather than dividing it equally was crucial to maintaining the family's wealth into the next generation. William Henry Vanderbilt. Doubling the fortune. William Henry Vanderbilt had been considered something of a disappointment by his father. He suffered from epilepsy as a child and was thought to be less capable than his younger brother. Cornelius even made William work as a farmer on Staten Island for years. But once given control of the railroad empire, William proved to be a brilliant businessman. Under his management from 1877 to 1885, the Vanderbilt fortune nearly doubled, growing to about $200 million, making William the richest man in the world at the time. He expanded the railroad network, improved efficiency, and managed the complex relationships with other railroad companies, financiers, and politicians that were necessary to keep the empire profitable. William was also more philanthropic than his father, giving substantial sums to Vanderbilt University, the Metropolitan Opera, and other institutions. He built the twin mansions at 640 to 642 Fifth Avenue that helped establish that street as the premier location for wealthy New Yorkers. These mansions, which cost about $3 million to build and furnish, were among the first of the great Gilded Age palaces in New York. But here's where we start to see the problem with maintaining these enormous fortunes across generations. William had 8 children, and when he died in 1885, after just 8 years in control of the fortune, he divided his wealth among them. The oldest 2 sons, Cornelius Vanderbilt II and William Kissam Vanderbilt, each received about $67 million. The other 6 children received smaller but still substantial amounts. This was the beginning of the gradual dissipation of the Vanderbilt fortune. Each subsequent generation divided the wealth further. Meanwhile, the costs of maintaining the family's lavish lifestyle, multiple mansions, enormous staffs, yachts, art collections, and the general expectation that Vanderbilts should live like royalty, continued to drain the capital. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, builder of the Great Mansion. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the grandson of the Commodore and builder of our doomed Fifth Avenue mansion, inherited about $67 million in 1885. He was active in the family's railroad business, but also devoted significant energy to being a proper gentleman, serving on the boards of charities and cultural institutions, maintaining the family's social position, and building and maintaining properties. The Fifth Avenue mansion, completed in stages between 1879 and the mid-1890s, was his primary residence and his statement to the world about the Vanderbilt family's importance. It cost somewhere between $3 and $6 million to build, sources vary, plus vast sums to furnish. He also maintained the Breakers, the famous cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, which cost about $7 million to build in the mid-1890s, plus another estate in the Adirondacks. When Cornelius II died in 1899 at age 55, his fortune had grown somewhat through the continued profitability of the railroad interests to about $70 to $80 million. But it was divided among his widow Alice and their children, and the pattern of wealth dissipation continued. By the 1920s, when the Fifth Avenue mansion was sold, maintaining it was a genuine financial hardship for the family, a situation that would have been unimaginable to the Commodore. Andrew Carnegie, the immigrant boy who built an empire. Andrew Carnegie's story is quite different from Vanderbilt's, and in some ways more representative of the American dream narrative, though it's important not to romanticize it too much. Carnegie was born in Scotland in 1835. His father was a weaver who was put out of work by the mechanization of textile production, an early victim of the Industrial Revolution. In 1848, when Andrew was 12, the family emigrated to Pennsylvania, settling near Pittsburgh. Andrew went to work immediately in a cotton mill as a bobbin boy, earning $1.20 per week. But Carnegie was ambitious, intelligent, and lucky. He got a job as a telegraph messenger boy, which put him in contact with businessmen and allowed him to learn about how business worked. He taught himself telegraphy and became a telegraph operator. He attracted the attention of Thomas A. Scott, a superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who hired Carnegie as his personal telegrapher and secretary. This was Carnegie's crucial break. Working for Scott, he learned about railroads, about corporate management, about finance, and about how to make money. Scott helped Carnegie make his first investments, including in the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company, which manufactured Pullman-style sleeping cars for railroads. Carnegie's share of the Woodruff dividends gave him capital to make further investments. During the Civil War, Carnegie worked for Scott, who had become Assistant Secretary of War, helping to organize military transportation. After the war, Carnegie went into business for himself, forming a company that built iron railroad bridges. Iron bridges were replacing wooden ones, and Carnegie positioned himself at the center of this transition. But Carnegie's real fortune came from steel. In the 1870s, he became convinced that steel would replace iron for rails and many other applications. He built his first steel mill, the Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, in 1875, using the Bessemer process. From the beginning, Carnegie focused on efficiency and cost reduction. He hired the best managers, invested in the latest technology, and drove his workers and managers hard. Carnegie's real innovation was vertical integration. He didn't just own steel mills. He bought the iron ore mines that supplied the raw material, the coal mines that provided fuel, the limestone quarries that provided flux for the steel-making process, the ships and railroads that transported these materials to his mills, and even some of the companies that used his steel. By controlling every stage of the production process, he could reduce costs and increase profits. He also pioneered what we might call ruthless efficiency. His plants ran 24 hours a day with workers on 12-hour shifts. He paid his workers less than many competitors, though still reasonably well for the time, and expected total dedication. He broke strikes brutally, the Homestead Strike of 1892, where Carnegie's company used private security forces, Pinkerton detectives, to break a union strike, resulted in deaths, and showed Carnegie's willingness to use violence to maintain control. But the results were spectacular. By 1900, Carnegie Steel Company was producing more steel than all of Great Britain, about 3 million tons per year. The company's profits were enormous, and since Carnegie owned the majority of the stock, most of those profits went directly to him. In 1901, J.P. Morgan organized a buyout of Carnegie Steel, combining it with several other companies to form U.S. Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar corporation. Carnegie's share of the sale price was $480 million, about $16 billion in today's dollars, paid in gold bonds. At age 65, Carnegie was the richest man in the world. What Carnegie did next was remarkable. He spent the rest of his life giving away his fortune. He'd written an essay called The Gospel of Wealth in 1889, arguing that the wealthy had a moral obligation to use their money for the public good. He funded the construction of over 2,500 public libraries, Carnegie Libraries, across America and around the world. He founded Carnegie Mellon University, built Carnegie Hall in New York, established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and gave away about $350 million, 90% of his fortune, before his death in 1919. Carnegie's example of systematic philanthropy influenced many other wealthy Americans and helped establish the tradition of major charitable giving that continues today. But it's also worth noting that his philanthropy came after he'd made his fortune through practices that were often brutal to workers and competitors. John D. Rockefeller, the greatest fortune in American history. If Andrew Carnegie was the richest man in the world in 1901, John D. Rockefeller quickly surpassed him and became, arguably, the wealthiest person in modern history relative to the total economy. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York. His father was a traveling salesman and con man who was often absent. His mother was a devout Baptist who instilled in him a strong work ethic and a commitment to tithing, giving 10% of his income to the church, a practice Rockefeller maintained throughout his life. Rockefeller went into business as a teenager, working as a bookkeeper and learning about finance and commerce. In 1863, at age 23, he invested in an oil refinery in Cleveland, Ohio. The oil industry was brand new. Edwin Drake had drilled the first successful oil well in Pennsylvania just 4 years earlier. And it was chaotic, with hundreds of small producers and refiners competing. Rockefeller saw opportunity in this chaos. In 1870, he founded the Standard Oil Company with several partners, but he was the driving force and the majority owner. His strategy was simple in concept, but brilliant in execution. Consolidate the industry. Here's how it worked. Rockefeller recognized that the key to controlling the oil industry wasn't production, drilling for oil, but refining and transportation. Crude oil by itself wasn't useful. It had to be refined into kerosene, the main product at the time used for lighting, lubricating oils and other products, and refined products had to be shipped to customers, primarily by railroad. Rockefeller negotiated secret deals with railroads to get lower shipping rates than his competitors, so-called rebates. Because he shipped such large volumes, he could demand these discounts. This gave Standard Oil a significant cost advantage over smaller refineries. Then Rockefeller began buying up competitors. Sometimes this was amicable. He'd offer to buy a competing refinery at a fair price, and the owner would sell. But often it was more aggressive. Standard Oil would cut prices in a particular market, selling kerosene at or below cost to drive local refiners out of business. Once the competitor was bankrupt or desperate, Rockefeller would buy them out cheaply. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of oil refining in the United States. This was a true monopoly. Rockefeller could essentially set prices for kerosene and other petroleum products, and customers had no choice but to pay them. Rockefeller also pioneered the use of what was called the trust structure. Since Standard Oil couldn't legally own stock in other companies in multiple states, Rockefeller created a trust where stockholders in dozens of different refining companies would put their stock into the trust in exchange for trust certificates. The trustees, controlled by Rockefeller, then managed all the companies as a single entity. This got around legal restrictions on cross-state corporate ownership and allowed Rockefeller to control a vast empire while staying within the law, technically. The profits from this monopoly were staggering. Standard Oil's dividends to Rockefeller personally were in the millions of dollars per year. And this was at a time when a skilled worker might earn $500 to $1,000 per year. The company's market value grew into the hundreds of millions. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil violated the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it broken up into 34 separate companies. These included companies that still exist today, like ExxonMobil, originally Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York, Chevron, originally Standard Oil of California, and BP America, originally Standard Oil of Ohio. Here's the ironic part. The breakup made Rockefeller even richer. As an investor in all of the successor companies, he found that the combined value of the separate companies was actually greater than the value of the unified Standard Oil had been. His fortune, already in the hundreds of millions, grew to over $1 billion by 1913, the first American billionaire. At his peak, Rockefeller's wealth was estimated at $1.4 billion, which represented nearly 2% of total American economic output. Adjusted for the size of the economy, this would be equivalent to somewhere between $400 and $600 billion in modern terms, making him possibly the richest person in American history in relative terms. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller became a major philanthropist in his later years. He founded the University of Chicago, established the Rockefeller Foundation, which helped eradicate hookworm in the American South and yellow fever worldwide, funded medical research that led to treatments for diseases like tuberculosis, and gave away about $540 million during his lifetime, roughly half his fortune. Rockefeller lived to age 97, dying in 1937, and saw both the peak of his power in the early 1900s and the transformation of American society that made that kind of concentrated wealth increasingly difficult to maintain and defend. What these men had in common, looking at Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, several patterns emerge. First, they operated in industries that were crucial to America's industrial transformation: transportation, steel, and energy. They weren't making luxury goods or services. They were controlling the fundamental infrastructure and materials that the entire economy depended on. Second, they all understood and exploited economies of scale. Bigger was more efficient, which made more profits, which allowed further expansion. They built business empires that dominated their industries. Third, they all operated in an era of minimal regulation. There were essentially no antitrust laws, no meaningful corporate regulations, no income taxes, and no restrictions on business practices. They could accumulate wealth and power in ways that would be impossible, or at least much more difficult, today. Fourth, none of them came from established wealthy families. Vanderbilt started as a poor ferry captain's son, Carnegie as an impoverished immigrant, Rockefeller as the son of a con man. This was genuinely a period when individual initiative and ruthlessness could lead to unprecedented wealth. Though, of course, it's important to recognize that for every Carnegie or Rockefeller, there were thousands of equally ambitious people who failed or achieved only modest success. Success required not just hard work and intelligence, but also luck, timing, and often a willingness to engage in practices that we'd consider unethical today. Fifth, they all, particularly Carnegie and Rockefeller, became major philanthropists in their later years, perhaps recognizing that their wealth had been accumulated through practices that harmed others, or perhaps genuinely believing they had a responsibility to give back. This created a model of philanthropic capitalism that continues to influence how wealthy Americans think about their obligations to society. Old money versus new money, the battle for social acceptance. Now we come to one of the most fascinating aspects of Gilded Age society: the conflict between old money and new money, between established social elites and newly wealthy industrialists. This might seem like trivial social drama, but it actually reveals a lot about American society and how power dynamics work. The world of old money. In the 1870s and 1880s, New York City had a well-established upper class. These were families who had been wealthy for generations, often dating back to colonial times or the early Republic. Names like Astor, Livingston, Van Rensselaer, Schermerhorn, Stuyvesant. These families had made their money in the 18th or early 19th century through various means. The Astors in fur trading and real estate, the Livingstons in land ownership and trade, the Van Rensselaers as patroons, large landowners, in colonial New York. By the late 19th century, these families might not have been as wealthy as the Vanderbilts or Carnegies, but they had something the new industrialists desperately wanted: social legitimacy. They were considered old money, refined, cultured, connected to European nobility through marriage or association, educated at the best schools, comfortable with the intricate rules of elite society. Old money families had a particular worldview. Wealth should be inherited, not earned through work, which was considered rather vulgar. Manners, taste, and proper behavior were paramount. There were strict rules about everything from how to dress for different occasions to how to address letters to when and where one could receive visitors. European culture, particularly French and British, was considered superior to American culture. Many old money families maintained connections to European nobility and tried to marry their children into titled families. This world had its gatekeepers, people who decided who was in society and who was out. And the most powerful gatekeeper of all was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known as Mrs. Astor. Caroline Astor, the Queen of New York society. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into one of New York's old Dutch families. She married William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of John Jacob Astor, the fur trader and real estate magnate who had been the richest person in America when he died in 1848. This marriage allied two prominent old money families and positioned Caroline at the center of New York elite society. Mrs. Astor took her social position very seriously. She believed that society needed structure and order, and that not everyone with money deserved to be part of elite society. With the help of Ward McAllister, a social arbiter and would-be aristocrat, she essentially created the rules for what would become known as the 400. The story goes that McAllister observed that Mrs. Astor's ballroom could comfortably hold about 400 people, and he declared that there were only about 400 people in New York society worth knowing. In 1892, the New York Times published a list of the 400, though it actually only had 273 names. Being on this list meant you were accepted into the highest levels of New York society. Not being on it meant you were outside, no matter how wealthy you might be. Mrs. Astor held an annual ball that was the most important social event of the New York season. An invitation to Mrs. Astor's ball was the ultimate sign of social acceptance. She also received visitors every Monday afternoon, and leaving your calling card at her mansion was a necessary social ritual. If she returned your call, you were accepted. If she didn't, you were effectively shut out of elite society. This might all sound absurd from a modern perspective, but it mattered enormously at the time. Elite society wasn't just about parties and social events. It was about power, business connections, marriageable alliances, and social status. Being accepted into this world could mean business opportunities, advantageous marriages for your children, and generally being treated as a person of importance. Being excluded meant your wealth might be acknowledged, but you'd never be fully respected. The Vanderbilt social struggle. The Vanderbilt family faced this exclusion acutely. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, was fabulously wealthy, but was not considered socially acceptable. He was rough, crude, barely educated, and had started as a ferry captain, hardly the background of a gentleman. Mrs. Astor and the old money families looked down on him as a vulgar upstart, someone who had money but no breeding or refinement. This continued into the next generation. William Henry Vanderbilt was somewhat more refined than his father, but he was still fundamentally a businessman who worked for a living. He built his Fifth Avenue mansions partly to demonstrate that the Vanderbilts had arrived socially, but it wasn't enough to gain full acceptance. The breakthrough came through William Henry's daughter-in-law, Alva Vanderbilt. Alva had been born Alva Smith in Mobile, Alabama, to a family that had once been wealthy but had lost their fortune in the Civil War. She married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of the Commodore, in 1875, and she was determined to use the Vanderbilt wealth to break into elite society. The costume ball that changed everything. In 1883, Alva threw what would become the most famous party of the Gilded Age. She had just completed building a mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue at 52nd Street, designed by Richard Morris Hunt to look like a French Renaissance chateau. To celebrate the completion and to force her way into society, she planned an elaborate costume ball. The ball would be invitation only, and Alva sent invitations to nearly everyone important in New York society, except Mrs. Astor and her family. This created a social crisis. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, desperately wanted to attend. All her friends were going, but according to the strict social rules of the time, the Astors couldn't accept an invitation from the Vanderbilts because Mrs. Astor had never formally acknowledged Alva Vanderbilt by making a social call. The pressure mounted. Carrie begged her mother. Other society matrons suggested that perhaps it was time to recognize the Vanderbilts. After all, they were enormously wealthy and weren't going away. Finally, Mrs. Astor gave in. She put on her most formal attire, rode her carriage to the Vanderbilt mansion, and left her calling card, the formal social acknowledgement that Alva had been waiting for. The next day, an invitation to the ball arrived for the Astors. The ball itself, held on March 26, 1883, was spectacular beyond anything New York had seen. Over 1,200 guests attended, far more than 400 incidentally. Costumes were elaborate and expensive. Many had been made in Paris specifically for the event. There were costumes representing everything from Venetian noblewomen to characters from literature to historical figures. Alva herself came dressed as a Venetian princess in a costume that cost $100,000, about $3 million today. The mansion was decorated lavishly with thousands of flowers, elaborate lighting, and careful attention to every detail. There were several rooms for dancing, each with its own orchestra. Dinner was served at midnight, with multiple courses prepared by French chefs. The entire event cost an estimated $250,000, about $7 to $8 million today. The ball was covered extensively by newspapers, and it was unanimously considered a triumph. Alva Vanderbilt had used her money and her talent for entertaining to force Mrs. Astor to acknowledge the Vanderbilts. From this point forward, the Vanderbilts were accepted into the highest levels of New York society. The broader implications. The Vanderbilts' successful social campaign represented a shift in American society. The old aristocracy, based on inherited wealth and lineage, was giving way to a new aristocracy based on massive industrial fortunes. By the 1890s, the distinction between old money and new money had largely broken down in New York. The 400 included many industrial fortunes alongside the old Dutch and colonial families. This didn't mean social hierarchy disappeared, far from it. It just meant that the entry requirements changed. Wealth alone wasn't enough. Plenty of wealthy people remained outside elite society. But sufficient wealth, combined with the right behaviors, the right education, the right clothes, and the right willingness to follow social rules, could gain acceptance. The conflict also revealed something important about American society. Despite the nation's democratic rhetoric and belief in equality, there was a strong desire among some Americans to create a European-style aristocracy. The elaborate social rituals, the obsession with titles and European nobility, the strict hierarchy, all of this was an attempt to import European class structures into American society. This tension between democratic ideals and aristocratic aspirations has never fully been resolved in American culture. The Gilded Age was perhaps the period when the aristocratic impulse was strongest, but echoes of it continue today in country clubs, elite private schools, exclusive social organizations, and the continued fascination with old money families. Fifth Avenue, when Manhattan became a palace row. The social competition between old money and new money, and the eventual acceptance of industrial fortunes into elite society, had a very visible physical manifestation: the transformation of Fifth Avenue into what was essentially a street of palaces. The geography of wealth. In the early 19th century, wealthy New Yorkers lived downtown, in areas like Washington Square and Gramercy Park. Fifth Avenue existed, but it was largely undeveloped above 42nd Street. As the city grew northward after the Civil War, wealthy families began building further up the avenue. By the 1870s, the area around 50 to 60 streets was becoming fashionable. The location was ideal, still on Manhattan, as opposed to Brooklyn or other boroughs, with good views, relatively quiet, still largely residential, and close to Central Park, which had opened in the 1860s. The Vanderbilts were pioneers in building grand mansions in this area. William Henry Vanderbilt built his twin mansions at 640 to 642 Fifth Avenue, 51st and 52nd Streets, between 1879 and 1881. These weren't typical New York townhouses. They were massive, elaborate structures designed by the Herder brothers, one of the leading interior design firms of the era, and filled with European art and furniture. Once the Vanderbilts established their presence, other wealthy families followed. Fifth Avenue, between roughly 51st and 91st Streets, became known as Millionaire's Mile, or in some sections, Vanderbilt Row, as multiple Vanderbilt family members built mansions near each other. The architecture of wealth. The mansions built during this period were remarkable for their sheer size, their architectural ambition, and their cost. These weren't just large houses. They were designed to look like European palaces, chateaux, and manor houses, transplanted to Manhattan. Richard Morris Hunt became the favored architect for many of these projects. Hunt had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the premier architecture school in the world, and he brought European architectural styles to America. He designed several Vanderbilt mansions, including the William K. Vanderbilt Mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, which looked like a French Renaissance chateau, and the Breakers in Newport for Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, which eventually occupied the entire block front between 57th and 58th Streets, went through several building phases. It started as a more modest townhouse designed by George B. Post in 1879, but was greatly expanded in the 1890s with additions by Richard Morris Hunt. The final structure had 137 rooms on 5 floors, plus additional servants' quarters and basements. The mansion featured a grand entrance hall 3 stories high, with a marble staircase, stained glass windows by John Lafarge, and elaborate carved details. There were multiple ballrooms, a large one for major entertainments, and a smaller one for more intimate gatherings. A music room, a library with walls covered in hand-tooled Moroccan leather, a morning room with Tiffany glass, dining rooms large and small, and dozens of bedrooms and guest rooms. Every room was decorated in a different style. One might be French Renaissance, another Italian Renaissance, another Louis XV, another English Tudor. The walls were covered in silk damask, leather, carved wood paneling, or elaborate murals. The ceilings were decorated with painted scenes, molded plaster, or gold leaf. The floors were often marble or mosaic work. The fireplaces were carved marble, each one unique. And the Vanderbilts weren't alone. Up and down Fifth Avenue, similar mansions rose. The William K. Vanderbilt Mansion, 665th at 52nd Street, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in a French Renaissance style, completed 1882, cost about $3 million. It featured a grand hall with a marble staircase, elaborate stonework on the exterior, and interiors that were essentially European rooms transplanted to New York. The Benjamin Altman Mansion, 626 Fifth Avenue at 51st Street, home of the department store magnate, built in the 1880s. The Andrew Carnegie Mansion, 2 East 91st Street, technically on 5th Avenue at 91st, designed by Babb, Cook, and Willard, completed 1902, cost about $1.5 million. Built in a Georgian style, it was somewhat more restrained than some of the Vanderbilt palaces, but still impressive. It's now the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. The Henry Clay Frick Mansion, 1 East 71st Street at 5th Avenue, designed by Carrere and Hastings, completed 1914. Frick specifically intended it to eventually become a museum, and it's now the Frick Collection. The Mrs. Astor Mansion, 845th Avenue at 65th Street, where Caroline Astor held her famous balls. It was later replaced by the Temple Emmanuel Synagogue. The Cornelius Vanderbilt III Mansion, 645th Avenue at 51st Street, inheriting and modifying his grandfather William Henry's original mansion, and dozens more. By 1900, Fifth Avenue from the 40s to the 90s was lined with massive private mansions, each trying to outdo the others in size, architectural impressiveness, and cost. The costs were staggering building. These mansions required enormous capital investment. The William K. Vanderbilt Mansion cost about $3 million to build and furnish in the early 1880s. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II Mansion cost even more over its various building phases. The Breakers in Newport cost about $7 million. These are 1880s to 1890s dollars. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking about $100 to $200 million for a single private residence. But the initial construction cost was only the beginning. Maintaining these properties required constant expenditure. The annual operating costs for a major Fifth Avenue mansion could easily exceed $100,000 to $200,000 per year in the early 1900s. This included staff salaries for 30 to 60 servants, property taxes, which increased as Manhattan real estate values rose, heating costs, enormous given the size of the buildings and the need to heat them in winter, maintenance and repairs, roofs, plumbing, electrical systems, stonework, woodwork, insurance, utilities, food for the family and staff, supplies and materials. When you consider that even families with fortunes of $50 to $100 million might be earning only 3 to 5% per year in investment returns, so $1.5 to $5 million per year in income, spending $200,000 per year just on one residence was a significant drain on resources, especially when many families owned multiple properties, a Newport cottage, an Adirondacks camp, sometimes estates abroad. Why build such houses? Given the enormous costs, why did wealthy families build such massive mansions? Several reasons. First, genuine appreciation for art and architecture. Many of these families were serious collectors who loved beautiful things and wanted to create spaces worthy of their collections. When Carnegie or Frick built mansions, they were thinking about how to display their art collections to best advantage. Second, social status. Your mansion announced to the world who you were and how important you were. The bigger and more impressive your house, the higher your social standing. In a society without formal aristocratic titles, the mansion served as a marker of nobility. Third, entertaining. These mansions were designed for large-scale entertaining, balls, dinners, receptions. The ballrooms, dining rooms, and public spaces were meant to accommodate hundreds of guests. If you wanted to maintain your position in society, you needed to entertain, and you needed a space grand enough to do it properly. Fourth, family legacy. These families were thinking dynastically. They were building houses they expected their children and grandchildren to inherit and maintain. The mansions were meant to be permanent family seats, like European aristocratic estates. Fifth, competition. Once the Vanderbilts built their palaces, everyone else in their social circle felt pressure to do likewise. No one wanted to be seen as less successful or important than their peers. The problem of permanence. But there was a fundamental problem with these mansions that their builders didn't fully appreciate. They were built for a very specific social and economic context that was already beginning to change even as they were being completed. The mansions assumed the continued availability of cheap servant labor. By the 1910s and 1920s, this was becoming increasingly untrue. The mansions assumed relatively low taxes and minimal government interference. Progressive era reforms were already changing this. The mansions assumed that concentrations of wealth would be permanent and could be passed intact to future generations. Estate taxes and the division of fortunes among children undermined this assumption. Most importantly, the mansions assumed that the Fifth Avenue location would remain desirable residential area. But Manhattan real estate is fundamentally about highest and best use. And by the 1920s, the highest and best use of prime Fifth Avenue real estate wasn't private mansions. It was commercial development. All of these factors combined to make the great Fifth Avenue mansions surprisingly ephemeral. Built to last centuries, most of them lasted only 40 to 50 years before being demolished. The power of the ball, how parties ruled society. If Fifth Avenue mansions were the stage sets of Gilded Age high society, then the balls, dinners, and elaborate entertainments held in those mansions were the performances that played out on those stages. And make no mistake, these weren't just parties in any casual sense. They were crucial social rituals that determined social standing, formed alliances, made and destroyed reputations, and in many ways distributed power among the elite. The mechanics of a Gilded Age ball. A typical grand ball thrown by a leading family involved months of planning and enormous expense. Let's walk through what would be involved. Invitations. The guest list was the first crucial decision. Who was invited and who was excluded was a statement about social hierarchy. Invitations would be sent out weeks in advance on engraved cards, delivered by hand or messenger, never by mail. That would be too impersonal. The invitation format followed strict rules. Certain phrases had to be used, names had to be styled correctly, the timing and dress requirements had to be specified. Being invited was an honor. Not being invited, especially if you expected to be or if people in your social circle were invited, was a social disaster. People would sometimes learn they were excluded only when friends mentioned receiving invitations, which could be devastating. Preparations. The mansion would be prepared weeks in advance. Additional staff might be hired temporarily. Florists would be brought in to decorate the public rooms. We're talking thousands of flowers arranged throughout the house. Special lighting might be installed. Musicians would be hired, typically a full orchestra, sometimes more than one to play in different rooms. Caterers would be brought in, though the house's own chef might also be involved. For costume balls, which were popular, costumes had to be designed and made, often taking months and costing thousands of dollars. Many wealthy families had their costumes made in Paris by the same couturiers who made their regular clothes. The event itself. Guests would begin arriving around 10 p.m. Fashionable hours were late in this era. They would be announced by a butler or footman as they entered, their names called out so that the hosts and other guests knew who had arrived. There would be a receiving line where the host and hostess, possibly with honored guests or family members, would greet each arrival. Guests would then proceed to the ballroom or ballrooms. Dance cards were common, small booklets where ladies would note which gentleman had claimed which dance. The dances themselves were formal, waltzes, polkas, cotillions, and everyone was expected to know the steps. Not knowing how to dance properly was a social embarrassment. Around midnight, there would be a supper, not a casual buffet, but a sit-down dinner with multiple courses. The dining rooms would be set with the finest china, crystal, and silver. Place cards would indicate where each guest should sit, and the seating arrangement was planned as carefully as a diplomatic negotiation. Who sat next to whom, who was at the head table, who was honored with positions near the hosts. Getting the seating wrong could create social offenses. The menu would typically be elaborate French cuisine, multiple courses, exotic ingredients, dishes that required great skill to prepare. Wines would be carefully chosen to complement each course. The meal might last 2 or 3 hours. After supper, dancing would resume and continue until 2, 3, or even 4 a.m. Guests would gradually depart, bidding farewell to the hosts in a formal manner. The costs. These entertainments were breathtakingly expensive. We've already mentioned Alva Vanderbilt's 1883 costume ball at $250,000. Here are some other examples. The Bradley Martin Ball of 1897, held at the Waldorf Hotel, cost an estimated $370,000, about $12 to $13 million today. This ball became controversial because it was held during an economic depression when millions of Americans were unemployed and struggling. The ostentatious display of wealth was so offensive to public opinion that the Bradley Martin family eventually moved to England. Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, known for her elaborate entertainments, once threw a dinner party where the guest of honor was a monkey dressed in formal attire. This might sound silly, but it was covered extensively in newspapers and was meant to be ironic, a commentary on how ridiculous society entertainments had become. James Hazen Hyde, an insurance company heir, threw a ball in 1905 at Sherry's restaurant that cost over $200,000. The scandal this caused, given that the money came from an insurance company, led to his social downfall and eventual move to France. Why spend so much? because the scale and quality of your entertainments was a direct statement about your wealth, taste, and social importance. Throwing a modest party when everyone expected grand ones was social suicide. You had to meet or exceed expectations. The social functions. These balls and dinners served several crucial functions beyond mere entertainment. Marriage market. For young women of the upper class, balls were essentially job interviews. The goal was to meet eligible men, be seen by potential suitors and their families, and ideally, make an advantageous match. A girl's debut into society, her debutante ball, was one of the most important events of her life. From that point forward, she would attend balls and parties with the explicit goal of finding a husband. Young men also used these events to meet potential wives, though they had somewhat more flexibility in the timing and choice. For both sexes, the stakes were high. A good marriage could secure your family's social position, create business alliances, even merge fortunes. A poor match or failure to marry well could damage your family's standing. Business networking. While business was not discussed explicitly at social events, that would be vulgar, these gatherings were opportunities for business connections to form. Men would meet, establish rapport, discover common interests. Later, these social connections could turn into business partnerships, investment opportunities, or information sharing. In an era before formalized business networking events, social occasions served this function. Political influence. Wealthy families used their social power to influence politics. Politicians would be invited to balls and dinners, exposed to the concerns and perspectives of the wealthy, and subtly, or not so subtly, lobbied on various issues. Campaign contributions might be discussed. Introductions. Between politicians and businessmen would be facilitated. While the Gilded Age elite didn't have formal political power, they had enormous informal influence. Cultural patronage. Balls and dinners were also occasions for promoting cultural institutions. Charity balls raised money for hospitals, museums, orchestras, and other causes favored by the elite. Attending and contributing was expected, and those who didn't participate risked social censure. Information exchange. In an era before mass media, social events were where people learned news and gossip. Who was succeeding in business? Who was in financial trouble? Whose marriage was in difficulty? Who was rising in society and who was falling? All of this information circulated at balls and dinners, and being excluded from these events meant being excluded from crucial information networks. The newspaper coverage. One fascinating aspect of Gilded Age balls was that they were covered extensively by newspapers. The social columns of newspapers like the New York Times, the New York Herald, and others would report in detail on major social events, who attended, what they wore, how the event was decorated, what was served, any notable social interactions. This coverage served several purposes. For the hosts, it was free publicity that announced their social importance to the broader public. For guests, being mentioned in a favorable social column was a mark of status. For newspapers, society coverage sold papers. The general public was fascinated by how the wealthy lived. But the coverage also served a gatekeeping function. Social journalists, particularly the most influential ones, could make or break reputations. A negative mention could damage someone's social standing. Conversely, consistently positive coverage could help establish someone as a social leader. The most famous social arbiter was Ward McAllister, Mrs. Astor's ally, who wrote extensively about society for newspapers and who essentially acted as a judge of who was acceptable and who wasn't. His opinions mattered enormously, and ambitious families cultivated his favor. And the downsides. While these balls and entertainments were glamorous on the surface, they also had downsides. The pressure to constantly entertain, to outdo your peers, to maintain appearances was exhausting and expensive. Families could bankrupt themselves trying to keep up. The constant social competition created anxiety and stress. For women particularly, the social season was demanding. They were expected to attend multiple events per week during the season, roughly from fall through early spring, always perfectly dressed, always maintaining proper manners, always socially alert. It was, in effect, a full-time job being a society woman. Moreover, the emphasis on material display and social hierarchy could be psychologically damaging. Your worth as a person was judged by your family name, your wealth, your clothes, your house, your ability to throw parties. Those who couldn't compete felt the pressure acutely. Even those who succeeded felt the constant anxiety of maintaining their position. By the 1910s and 1920s, younger generations were beginning to rebel against this system. The formal balls and elaborate social rituals began to seem old-fashioned. Simpler, more casual entertaining became popular. The grand Gilded Age ball was dying along with the mansions where they were held. Malikaneların görünmeyen gücü, hizmetkar ordusu. Now let's pull back the curtain on something that's often overlooked when we talk about Gilded Age mansions. The massive army of servants required to make these households function. The reality is that none of these grand estates could have operated without dozens of domestic workers living in the house, working long hours, following strict rules, and remaining largely invisible to the families they served. The scale of domestic service. A typical large Fifth Avenue mansion employed 30 to 60 servants. The very largest establishments, like the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, might have 60 or more staff members. These weren't people who came in for a few hours a day. Most lived in the house, in small rooms on the upper floors or in separate servants' wings, and their entire lives revolved around the household. To put this in perspective, a mansion might have 15 to 20 family members and guests in residence at any given time, with 50 to 60 servants taking care of them. The servants outnumbered the family by 3 to 1 or more. The hierarchy. The servant hierarchy was strictly defined with clear ranks and responsibilities. At the top, butler and housekeeper. The butler was the highest-ranking male servant. In the best households, butlers were British. A British accent conferred status and was considered more refined than an American accent. The butler's responsibilities were extensive: overseeing all male servants, managing the wine cellar and serving wine at dinner, answering the door and announcing guests, overseeing the dining room service, managing the family's silver and ensuring it was properly maintained, sometimes handling some of the household accounts. Acting as a liaison between the family and the staff, a good butler at a major mansion could earn $1,000 to $1,500 per year when the average worker earned about $500, making it one of the best-paid servant positions. Butlers wielded significant power within the household. They could make or break lower servants' careers with their recommendations, and families relied on them heavily. The housekeeper was the female equivalent, though her domain was different. She oversaw all female servants, except sometimes the lady's maid and cook who might report directly to the mistress, all linen and bedding in the house, cleaning schedules and standards, supplies and household inventories, often some of the household accounts, relations with tradespeople and suppliers. Housekeepers were addressed as Mrs., regardless of marital status, as a mark of respect. They typically had their own sitting room and housekeeper's room, where they managed the household's affairs. They earned similar salaries to butlers and had similar authority. Specialized upper servants. Below the butler and housekeeper were several specialized positions. Chef. The chef, French was preferred, as French cuisine was considered the finest, managed the kitchen and all food preparation. In a great house, the chef was an artist whose creations were discussed and appreciated. Chefs could earn $1,200 to $2,000 per year or more if they were particularly renowned. They, helping her mistress dress and undress, the elaborate gowns of the era were impossible to put on or take off without help. Maintaining and repairing her mistress's wardrobe, arranging hair, this could take hours, drawing baths, sometimes acting as a confidant and companion. Ladies' maids often traveled with their mistresses and were among the most trusted servants. They earned $300 to $600 per year. Valet, the male equivalent, serving the master of the house. Responsibilities included helping him dress, maintaining his wardrobe, shaving him. Before safety razors, this required skill. Packing and unpacking for travel, sometimes handling correspondence or errands. Valets earned similar salaries to ladies' maids, typically had several kitchen staff working under them. Ladies' maid. Each adult woman in the family typically had her own ladies' maid. The ladies' maid's responsibilities included middle ranks, the working servants below. These upper servants were the people who did most of the actual work. Footmen, young men in livery, uniform, who served at table, stood behind chairs during formal dinners, opened carriage doors, ran errands, performed various physical tasks. Footmen were often hired partly for their appearance. Tall, good-looking young men were preferred. They earned $200 to $400 per year. Parlor maids, senior female servants who cleaned the public rooms, drawing rooms, library, dining room, helped serve at table, answered the door in houses without enough footmen, sometimes helped with guests. They earned $150 to $300 per year. Chambermaids cleaned bedrooms and private spaces, made beds, which was complicated given the elaborate bedding of the era, emptied chamber pots and slop buckets before every room had plumbing, maintained fires in bedroom fireplaces. They earned $100 to $200 per year. Laundresses, full-time position given the enormous amount of laundry in these households. Elaborate dresses, men's shirts with detachable collars, bed linens, table linens, towels, servants' uniforms. Laundry was done by hand, was physically demanding, and required considerable skill. Laundresses earned $150 to $250 per year. Kitchen maids assisted the chef, prepared vegetables, made basic dishes, helped with serving, earned $100 to $200 per year. Scullery maids. At the bottom of the hierarchy, scullery maids washed dishes and pots, scrubbed floors, did the dirtiest, most physically demanding kitchen work, often worked 16+ hours per day. They earned as little as $50 to $100 per year and were usually very young girls, often recent immigrants. Outdoor staff. Large mansions also had outdoor staff. Coachmen managed the horses and carriages, drove the family where they needed to go. With the advent of automobiles in the 1900s to 1910s, this position evolved into chauffeur. Coachmen earned $300 to $500 per year. Grooms cared for the horses, maintained the stables, cleaned the carriages, earned $200 to $400 per year. Gardeners maintained any grounds the mansion had. City mansions might have small gardens. Country estates had extensive grounds requiring multiple gardeners. Night watchmen. Some very large establishments employed night watchmen for security. The reality of servant life. What was it actually like to be a servant in one of these great houses? The picture that emerges from surviving accounts is one of hard work, long hours, strict discipline, but also a certain security and even opportunities for advancement. Hours. A typical servant's day started around 6 a.m., earlier for scullery maids and kitchen staff who had to prepare breakfast, and might not end until 10 p.m. or later. There were brief breaks for meals, but servants were essentially on call all day. The one day off was typically Sunday afternoon into Monday morning, a half day every week. Living conditions. Servants lived in small rooms, usually on the upper floors or in separate servants' wings. These rooms were sparsely furnished, a bed, a small dresser, maybe a chair, and were often cold in winter and hot in summer. Male and female servants were strictly segregated, with separate staircases and areas. Uniforms. Servants wore uniforms that indicated their rank. Butlers and valets wore formal suits. Footmen wore livery, often in the family's colors, Maids wore black dresses with white aprons and caps during the day, switching to fancier uniforms with lace trim for evening. Kitchen staff wore practical work clothes and aprons. These uniforms had to be kept immaculate, which meant servants spent their limited free time washing and mending their own clothes. Rules. The rules governing servant behavior were extensive. Servants were expected to be invisible, to move through the house quietly, to work efficiently, without drawing attention. They used separate staircases and hallways, servants' stairs and corridors, to avoid being seen by the family. They could not speak to family members unless spoken to first. They could not make eye contact with family members. Male and female servants were not allowed to fraternize. Servants had to step aside and face the wall when a family member passed. They could not sit in the presence of family members. They addressed family members with formal titles. Ma'am, Sir, Mr. Vanderbilt. Never first names. Food. Servants ate in a separate servants' hall at specific times with their own hierarchy at table. Upper servants sat at one end, lower servants at the other. The food was generally good. Households that could afford elaborate meals for the family provided decent meals for servants, but it was plain compared to what the family ate. Why work as a servant? Given these conditions, why did people take these jobs? Several reasons. Security. Servants had a place to live, 3 meals a day, and a small salary. For poor people, especially immigrants, this was better than many alternatives. Opportunity. There was a clear path for advancement. A scullery maid could become a kitchen maid, then perhaps a parlor maid, maybe eventually a housekeeper. A footman could become a butler. These promotions came with better pay, better rooms, more respect. Training. Working in a great house taught valuable skills. Young women learned cooking, cleaning, sewing, and household management. Young men learned service, management, and deportment. These skills could lead to better positions or even to starting their own businesses. Alternatives were often worse. The alternatives for working-class people, especially women, were often less appealing. Factory work was dangerous, with long hours and low pay. Sweatshops in the garment industry were notorious for exploitation. Many jobs for women were even more poorly paid than domestic service. For immigrants who didn't speak English well, domestic service was one of the few options some servants did well. There are documented cases of servants who saved their money, invested wisely, and ended up relatively prosperous. Some butlers and housekeepers married and opened their own businesses, boarding houses, shops, small hotels. The discipline and skills learned in service could lead to success. The social distance. One striking aspect of the servant system was the complete social separation between servants and family. They lived in the same house. Servants knew intimate details of family life, yet they were treated as if they barely existed as people. Family members often didn't know servants' names, except for upper servants like the butler and housekeeper. They would refer to servants by their position: the maid, the footman. If multiple maids had the same role, the family might rename them for convenience. You'll be Mary while you work here, even if the girl's real name was something else. This social distance was maintained by all the rules we mentioned: the separate staircases, the prohibition on speaking, the requirement to be invisible. The goal was for the family to live as if the work of running the house happened magically, without having to think about the human beings doing that work. The system breaks down. The servant system that sustained Gilded Age mansions began to break down after World War I. Several factors contributed. Changed attitudes. The war had democratizing effects. Women who had worked in factories during the war were less willing to accept the subservient position of domestic service. Men who had fought in the trenches were less willing to bow and scrape to wealthy employers. Better alternatives. As the economy industrialized further, factory jobs became more available and often paid better than domestic service while offering more personal freedom. Department stores hired women as clerks. Offices hired women as typists and secretaries. These jobs had regular hours, weekends off, and more dignity than domestic service. Immigration restrictions. The Immigration Act of 1924 severely restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, cutting off the flood of immigrants who had provided much of the servant labor force. Rising wages. As labor became scarcer, servants could demand higher wages. This made the servant system more expensive. Changing technology. Some household tasks became easier with new technology. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, gas or electric cooking ranges instead of coal-fired stoves. This reduced the number of servants needed, but couldn't eliminate the need entirely for very large houses. Social stigma. Domestic service increasingly came to be seen as degrading. In earlier eras, being a servant in a great house carried some prestige. You were associated with an important family. By the 1920s, domestic service was seen as a mark of failure, something no ambitious person would accept if they had any alternative. By the 1920s, even wealthy families were finding it difficult to fully staff their mansions. This was one more factor that made maintaining these huge houses impractical. A 137-room mansion designed to be run by 60 servants became impossible to manage with only 20 or 30 staff. This staff shortage was a crucial factor in the abandonment and demolition of many Fifth Avenue mansions. Without an army of servants, these houses simply couldn't function, and the social and economic changes that made servants scarce couldn't be reversed. The beginning of the end, why it couldn't last. By the 1920s, the world of Gilded Age mansions and the social system they represented was already dying, though not everyone realized it yet. The demolition of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion in 1927 was just one of the most visible symbols of a broader transformation. Let's examine the multiple factors that brought down this apparently solid world. Factor 1. Taxation changed everything. The most dramatic change came from taxation. For most of the Gilded Age, the federal government had no income tax, except during the Civil War. The wealthy could accumulate fortunes and keep them almost entirely intact. This changed dramatically in the early 20th century. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, gave Congress the power to levy an income tax. Initially, the rates were modest. The top rate in 1913 was just 7% on incomes over $500,000, but World War I changed this dramatically. By 1918, the top rate had soared to 77% on incomes over $1 million. After the war, rates came down somewhat, but they remained much higher than the pre-1913 period. Wealthy families suddenly found a significant portion of their annual income going to the federal government. Even more destructive to the maintenance of great fortunes was the estate tax, also established around the same time. When wealthy individuals died, their estates were now taxed before being passed to heirs. The initial rates were modest, but they climbed quickly. By the 1920s, the estate tax could take 40% or more of very large estates. This had enormous implications for families like the Vanderbilts. Under the old system, Cornelius Vanderbilt could leave $95 million to his son William Henry, who could then leave $200 million to his children, and so on, with the fortune growing each generation. Under the new system, each transfer was taxed heavily, and the fortune shrank with each generation unless it was growing faster than the taxes could eat into it. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II estate provides a perfect example. When he died in 1899, his fortune of about $70 to $80 million was divided among his widow and children with minimal taxation. But when his widow Alice died in 1934, the estate taxes were substantial, and the family had to liquidate assets to pay them. The Fifth Avenue mansion had already been sold in 1926, partly to raise money for anticipated estate tax obligations. Factor 2. Property taxes became crushing. At the same time federal taxes were increasing, local property taxes on Manhattan real estate were also soaring. As Manhattan developed and land values increased, property tax assessments went up accordingly. The land underneath the Vanderbilt mansion, which might have been assessed at hundreds of thousands of dollars in 1900, was assessed at millions by the 1920s. These taxes had to be paid annually in cash, regardless of whether the family had income that year. For families whose wealth was tied up in real estate, art collections, stocks, and other assets, coming up with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash each year for property taxes was increasingly difficult. Moreover, the tax burden was ongoing and permanent. The maintenance costs of a mansion might be reduced by cutting staff or deferring maintenance, but property taxes had to be paid in full, on time, every year, or the property would be seized.